In the Pyrenees, a group of English teenaged air cadets and their leaders are preparing for the final climb of their 5-day trip.
So on the morning we were due to climb to the top of the Canigou, the cadets were up at around about 6 a.m. The weather was fantastic, the sun was starting to come up, it was really peaceful, and the cadets were just kind of quietly getting all our kit ready, making sure we had all our emergency and survival kit and things.
15-year-old Dominic Jones is one of the most experienced cadets in the group.
It was quite a nice day, it was nice weather, it was clear, and as a group we were sort of quite bubbly.
The cadets we were taking out had never done any big mountaineering before, they'd never been any higher than 1,400 metres. So there was a quiet air of determination amongst the group.
The conditions were good, and it was nice weather, it was sunny. We were all feeling really positive. Making sure everything was ready, and then we set off. That day we were hoping to climb Canigou, but we knew it was very unlikely we'd be able to actually get to the peak.
You've got to make sure that there's a reasonable path up onto the high tops. If those paths are covered in snow, that can make climbing exceptionally treacherous.
We were hopeful. We just had to go and see what the conditions were like when we got there.
When we got to our vantage point where we could see the summit, where we could see the route, we could see quite clearly that it was completely covered in snow. There were boulders and rocks sticking out, but the entire face in front of us was covered in snow. And at that point, I said, we're not going to get to the top today.
The cadets were disappointed because obviously they'd come to climb this peak, they'd come all the way to France to do it, but they knew that if we were saying we weren't going to do it, but there was a really good reason behind that.
I actually just said to them that this is a great spot to take some photographs, you can see the top of the mountain, get some shots, and while we were there, the weather really started to change. It started to cloud over, the temperature dropped, the wind started to pick up. Kind of made me think it's probably a good reason that we're not going to get to the top today. So we kind of decided we'll take some pictures, but then we'll head back down again, we'll have an early finish.
At that point, Dominic spotted something in the snow.
Will? Yeah.
I had noticed that there was a streak of red running in a vertical direction on the snow just ahead of us.
I couldn't really see anything, but obviously Dominic, with his sharp eyesight, could see this trail of blood.
I was quite convinced at that point that the red streak directly led to a black, crumpled heap of a person.
My heart stopped for a moment. I could see two objects lying in the snow, most likely people, and then above them, in the distance, what appeared to be a group of men stranded. I turned to Emma and just said, I'm going to have to go up and have a look and see what's going on. I didn't want to go up onto the slope on my own, but I didn't want to take Emma with me and leave the cadets on their own. So I turned to Dominic and asked him if he would be prepared to come up the slope with me.
Adrenaline's kicking in, you're just wanting to get up there and help however you can. These guys had slipped. It was obviously a dangerous condition, but we knew we had to do something.
You sure you're right? Yeah, come up with me, yeah?
I guess really I knew if these two guys were dead, that Dominic would probably be able to manage the shock of seeing them. And that's part of the reason I took him with me.
Let's go have a look then. Come on.
Right, see you in a bit.
We didn't say very much to each other on the way in, actually. The mood was very quiet, very contemplative. It was pretty hard going trekking through the snow, actually. I suddenly became aware of having to breathe a lot harder. We were ascending again, we were climbing higher now, so we were getting into a bit more altitude. This was the bit of the mountain that I didn't want to take any cadets onto. This was the bit of the mountain that we'd said we weren't going to go in. And yet here we were, carrying all our gear and some extra first aid kit from the rest of the group through this snow to try and get to these two casualties.
It's always there in the back of your mind that this could be a situation where somebody could quite easily die, but It's obviously made a lot more real when there's a lot of blood in front of you and there's a potential body at the bottom.
I really didn't expect to find them alive. I turned to Dominic and said, look, there's a real possibility here that they might be dead. Do you think you can manage that?
That's when the sort of reality hit that it could be more than just somebody with a few cuts and scrapes.
He just paused for a second and just said, yes sir, I can.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
I was then just quiet, going through in my head what I would do when I get there. If these people are dead, if they're alive, what would be the next step?
It just felt like something really serious was unfolding. As we pushed up through the snow, up the slope, and we got closer to these objects, it started to become obvious it was pretty horrendous. It was a car crash on the side of a mountain.
Initially when I'd first seen it, there was a bit of a heart-stopping moment. It was, this is quite serious. But we didn't know still at this point whether they were alive or dead.
One of them was lying on the side, off to the left. There was a huge trail of blood behind him. His rucksack was lying next to him. Some of his equipment was strewn on the floor. He wasn't making any noises, he wasn't talking. The other person was sitting slightly to the right in a hunched position. It was really obvious from the positions that they were in that they were in a really bad way. I still didn't know if they were alive. I got to him on the left and Dominic went round to the guy on the right.
You right?
We could see that the guy who was sat up was alive at this point.
The guy on the ground looked up at me and kind of tried to mouth a few words. That was the first time that we realised that they were still alive. I turned to Dominic and said, right, you need to start patching this guy up and I'm going to start patching this guy. And we just started getting our first aid kits out and just working through things really methodically.
There was quite a bit of panic in my head. You're obviously first aid trained, so ultimately you know it's up to you regardless of your age. It's up to you to do something. It becomes your duty almost.
I remember thinking there's just too much here for Dominic and I to deal with. We need Emma and we need some of the cadets to come up as well, and we need them to bring as many bandages and first aid kits as we've got amongst us. Up till that point, I'd never had anybody's life in my hands. I knew the two guys were going to live or die based on what we did in the next 10 minutes. Whilst we were busy wrapping up the two casualties, Emma and Matthew arrived with extra first aid kits.
The first thing that went through my mind was utter shock. I've never seen anything like that. I've never seen mountain injuries. It did take my breath away a little bit.
I asked Emma to get to work on the casualty who Dominic had been working on, the guy who was sitting still, and she started finishing off putting bandages on him, putting extra clothes on him. And Dominic gave me a hand to try and stabilise this guy who was lying on his back.
One of our priorities was to try and keep them warm, because if anything was going to really threaten their life, it would have been the hypothermia at that point. It was literally a case of emptying our bags of all our spare kit.
I was really concerned that we had two very, very serious casualties with life-threatening injuries in front of us. And then we had another 3 guys who were stranded on this ridge directly above us.
These 2 gentlemen obviously had fallen. So our main concern at that point was thinking, oh my goodness, we can't have any more casualties on our hands, you know. Because if they'd fallen, quite easily the others could have gone at any point.
I didn't want them falling off the mountain and becoming casualties themselves as they tried to climb down. I didn't want them knocking any rocks on us while we were working on these casualties below. We didn't have phone signal where we were tucked in around the back of the mountain. So I kind of had a bit of a think about it and thought, well, the sensible thing would be to bring them down to safety.
Will made the decision that he was going to start walking up to reach the climbers, and I was going to stay behind with 2 of the cadets.
We just looked at each other and knew that we couldn't just leave these guys where they were. We couldn't leave them stranded, so she knew I had to go up.
I think at that point, yeah, I was thinking this is really not good.
Climbing up onto the ridge was potentially the most dangerous thing that I was going to do. These two guys had already fallen down off this mountain, they'd hit rocks. I knew the snow slope was obviously quite precarious and dangerous. The snow wasn't in very good condition, it wasn't very stable. There was at least 300 metres of climbing to get to before I'd reach these guys. I guess in hindsight it didn't seem like a very sensible thing to do at all, but at the time it seemed like the only option. It seemed to take ages. My biggest concern was if I slipped while I was walking up, there would be not much of a chance of stopping myself. All around me were lots of rocks and broken ground, and any slip or fall at that point would mean I'd end up falling onto these rocks and falling through them, and having the same fate as the two guys below me. It was really serious actually at that point. There's definitely a sense that nobody else is going to be able to help you out if you have a situation. I was aware as I was climbing up that all the help was below me. There was no help above me. I was definitely on my own at that point. I got about halfway up and I turned and I looked back down. I could see Emma and the guys below me, and they were getting much smaller. The guys on the ridge weren't much bigger than they should have been. And I remember thinking, if I fall here or take a tumble, this could have really dire consequences for me.
Obviously these guys were in quite a bad way, particularly the guy that was on his back. He seemed to be drifting in and out of consciousness, and obviously the big danger was that he was going to slip unconscious and then stop breathing.
That was the point in my head where I was just thinking, this could be really, really bad. If we do have to go down a CPR route, once you really start, you can't stop until help comes. And I was mentally thinking, well, there's three of us. How long could we physically keep that going for?
That was the scariest part, was sitting, watching and trying to keep him conscious, I guess. And you keep talking, but obviously you're just panicking in case you did lose consciousness.
I think when you come across people in that situation where they really are on the brink of life and death, you couldn't leave them. You couldn't just walk away. If anything had to happen to them and they'd have spent their last moments on the side of a mountain alone, that was quite a dark thought in my head.
I finally got to where these other three fellows were. One of them spoke really clear English. He said, "Are you mountain rescue?" And I think I said, "No, I'm a school teacher," which there was then a look of horror on their faces. He explained to me that they were from Belgium, that they were on an expedition. He explained that they'd phoned mountain rescue already, which I was really relieved at. We were perched on this spot where their friends, I think, had fallen because they were directly below them. And it was a really narrow ledge. The weather was still getting worse. It was easily freezing. The cloud was coming in, and I was quite concerned that if we lost the visibility, it would make it much more difficult to get down. So I said to them, right, we need to descend. We need to get things moving. But on the other side, I needed them to be really careful. One wrong move, and any one of us could have been down the hill again. One option would have been to try and bring them down one at a time. But with the weather conditions getting much worse, I just felt that it was worth kind of taking the chance and getting them all down in one go. And this was one of those moments where you hope for a little bit of luck, a little bit of skill, and you think, right, well, we'll give it a go. I could see when looking at them that they were still quite scared. I guess there was some doubt in their mind that they could do it. Two of their friends had fallen down, so they were really quite apprehensive about coming with me. So I got the rope out and I tied those around their waists, talking to them about how I would be behind them with the rope and with the ice axe. In the unlikely event that one of them should fall, my job would be to try and arrest the group and stop us all from falling off the mountain. But I was acutely aware of any slip or trip at this point, and it would be all of us off the mountain, not just one.
Down you
But then pretty much at that point, the rescue helicopter flew across the ridge. I was utterly relieved. Never been so pleased to see the French Mountain Rescue before. You know, it was just, yeah, just fantastic.
I can't even explain how relieved I was when I saw that helicopter.
We didn't really know what to say to each other because there was just nothing you could say. I think everybody knew they had done the best they could do in that situation. It was a big sigh of relief.
In the hospital, they saw that I had broken all my ribs on the right side. I had one rib who was in the lung.
All my body, my arms, my legs were bruised.
And all my nails were broken from scrubbing the snow.
It's good that there are people like Will and his team in the world to help other people.
My savers from the day. Friends for life. I never forget them. It's a nice feeling.
On a day-to-day basis, it's not something you necessarily think about, but it's when people sort of mention it to you, it is quite nice knowing that you've saved somebody's life.
It's one of those moments where you think, actually, all that training, all that work you've done with them, you can see why you give up your weekends and your evenings, because they were just so professional. And I was just so proud of them.
When I think back to what Dominic and Matthew and Emma have done and saving these two guys' lives and keeping them alive, there's no greater thing that they could ever achieve with their life. From my point of view, it is probably the greatest responsibility and the greatest thing that I've ever had to do was have the lives of another man in my hands. And it's something that I'll never forget.